All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our final lecture of Chem 390. Hopefully, it is a bittersweet feeling of this being the final lecture of the course. Hopefully, you're happy because the course is almost over, but hopefully, you're also going to somewhat miss the content of the course. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part, but anyway, today is going to be sort of a similar to the vegetation lecture. It's going to be a little bit shorter, with the goal being giving you more time to focus on studying exam 2 and reviewing the material that will be on exam 2. And this is sort of just meant to complement our lecture on wildfire suppression strategies, and hopefully give you some insight as to some future practices that might become much more routine in the coming years as wildfires um, frequency increases. Okay, so it'll be a little bit of a shorter one today, or at least I'm intending it to be a little bit shorter. We'll see how well that works out. I'm pretty sure it'll be shorter. And then, yeah, just make sure that you do exam 2 before August 12th, I guess, is the real hard deadline. And exam 2, again, will not cover any of the material that was on exam 1. It will only cover our lectures on vegetation, toxicity, wildfire suppression, and this lecture currently on emerging wildfire prevention strategy. Okay, so everything from today's lecture is pretty much going to be sourced from this paper. Well, this is one in a series of papers, but it's about we'll talk about this, but prophylactic treatments of high-risk landscapes. So we'll talk about what that is. And like I said, there's a series of research papers on this topic, exploring various applications, toxicity effects of this stuff on soil pH. So we'll talk about that, but most of the information is coming from this lecture, or this paper rather. And as you can see by the abbreviation down here, PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I talked about this in the stratospheric ozone lecture. It's a really, really reputable journal. And these researchers have been publishing topics related to this prophylactic treatment of high-risk landscapes. They have multiple papers in PNAS, multiple papers in really, really high journals with high reputation. So this is something that I am willing to bet will be a more prevalently used strategy in the coming future. So that's why I felt it was important enough to talk about it in this course. Okay, so let's just quickly recap last time, because it is going to be important for our lecture today. Last time we talked all about fire retardants, we talked about brominated fire retardants, we talked about ammonium polyphosphate, and then we also talked about some firefighting foams. So the chemistry that we're going to be learning about today is going to be related to our discussions on ammonium polyphosphate, which is where this schematic I have here came from, where ammonium polyphosphate, remember, was a really the most prevalently used fire retardant, at least for wildfires. And the way it works is the ammonium polyphosphate, or the ammonium phosphate, breaks down to phosphoric acid when heated, and this phosphoric acid dehydrates cellulose or plant material and converts it totally to final products and forms this insulating char layer around the plant matter that prevents oxygen from getting into the plants, and thus halting the combustion process. Okay, and I should mention also that last time I did not talk about this, but the fire retardant Phos-Chek, which is one that you might have heard of before, is a really prevalent fire retardant. This is basically this exact same chemistry up here. So this is ammonium monophosphate, so something like this, or diammonium, or sorry, monoammonium phosphate or diammonium phosphate is what I meant to say, where it's basically the exact same chemistry that I have above. All of this stuff is the exact same chemistry that applies to Phos-Chek and how Phos-Chek works. And this is an important topic for today because one of the things the researchers do that we'll learn about in a sec is they mix their prophylactic treatment with Phos-Chek as a way to stop fires before they happen. Okay, I guess that's the TLDR of what today's lecture will be about. It's about preventing wildfires from the start, not putting them out once they have started. Okay, but yeah, so Phos-Chek does all of these same processes, so everything the same. It's just not in a polyphosphate form. It's just in a monophosphate or orthophosphate, as we like to say in chemistry, but still, same process applies. It extinguishes fires by dehydrating the plant matter and forming this insulating char layer, okay? So let's quickly talk about the motivation for the topic of today. And this motivation comes on the left hand of this slide here, where this is a map of all wildfires that occurred in California from 2009 to 2018. So the paper that I'm using for today was published in 2019. That's why there isn't more data included in here. But you can see that there was a lot of regions affected by wildfires throughout that decade, basically. And everywhere here marked in red is a high-risk area, meaning really dry vegetation, really arid conditions, really high temperatures, and generally high winds that would lead to a fire or a wildfire starting. And you can see that in the regions that are marked high risk, that 80% of the wildfires were in high risk regions. Is what I'm trying to say here, okay? And the idea behind the topic of that we're going to be learning about today is, well, what if we could treat the plants in these high risk areas with some benign coating, and have that coating contain fire retardants so that should a fire break out, it would be extinguished on the spot with no need of any application of a fire retardant after the wildfire started, okay? So the idea here is you spray the plants with this chemical. They have here retardant loaded viscoelastic fluid. So retardant loaded just means that there's some, ammonium phosphate in here. So I'll just draw this. So this has like Phos-Chek or APP in it. And then viscoelastic is a word that is used to describe fluids. Basically just means a goopy gelatinous fluid that is somewhat stretchy and elastic and can evenly coat this plant matter, okay? And the idea is then that you would have this really benign coating on the plants. And like I said, should a wildfire break out, well, then the Phos-Chek in this coating would form phosphoric acid, which would react with the burning cellulose and dehydrate it to form that insulating char layer, and do all of that on the spot, even if no one's present monitoring the area. So that's the whole idea behind all of this. And we're sort of going to be exploring today the underlying chemistry of what is going on with this. How safe is this for the environment? How safe is this for people to be exposed to, etc., okay? And I guess I should mention here the tiers in these bar graphs. These might be a little strange. The tiers are referring to threat regions. So tier 2 threat region, tier 3 threat region. Again, it's just defined based off of how likely or how at risk a certain area is for a fire to break out. And what this is showing is that the percent of wildfire ignitions in high risk locales, so 80% were across the state, were in these high-risk regions, and then less than that were in these tier 2 to tier 3 threat regions. And then acres burned per fire, you can see like there's a lot of acreage of combusted areas that resulted from these wildfires breaking out. So, yeah. Now, I'm not going to quiz you on that part, so don't worry. So let's just get into the chemistry of what is this retardant-loaded viscoelastic fluid? How does it work? How effectively does it prevent wildfires? And then how is it assessed towards its toxicity and its environmental effects? Because that's a really important thing, right? So if we were just to jump in straight into how these are made, so the chemical composition of these viscoelastic fire retardants, or this viscoelastic material, is it's composed of hydroxy ethyl cellulose, or methyl cellulose. So these are just variations of cellulose. So the hydroxyethyl versus methyl is denoting what's on this oxygen here, this little R group, as we like to call it in organic chemistry. And don't worry too much about what these structures are. We didn't talk about the chair conformation of cyclohexane, and we didn't talk about, like valence share electron repulsion theory. So really all you need to know about this is that what's in these brackets is some form of cellulose, which again is glucose molecules linked together to form a molecule, okay? So think of each of these as C6H12O6. You might be screaming at your screen, wait, I only count 5 oxygens in here. Well, that's because to take a glucose molecule and to link it into a chain, you need to remove water for every glucose that you link together, so you lose an oxygen by doing that. All of that is not important and not going to be something you need to know for an exam. So I like this, what they did in this article. They just abbreviated these polymer chains of cellulose into a nice little line. I like that. Very pictorial, very much in the realm of what chemistry we need to know for our course, okay? So just think of this cellulose as a thin line of chained glucose molecules together, okay? And then this is mixed with colloidal, so that's a new word, silica particles. So we'll talk about colloidal in a sec, but silica particles, we sort of saw that in the very, very first lecture of the course when we talked about particulate matter. So silica is SiO2. I might not have given it that specific name, but we talked about this as one of the forms of particulate matter that is present in wildfire smoke. And I said in that very first lecture that this mostly comes from dirt, because dirt and rocks are largely composed of aluminosilicates and silicates, or forms of silica, okay? So what these researchers are doing on a very approximate level is taking particles of dirt, mixing it with this hydroxycellulose, okay? And this word colloidal, so colloidal is referring to a suspension of particles in water. So we talked about aerosols in our atmospheric chemistry lectures. Let me just finish this thought here. So these are particles. Oops, I want black. Suspension of particles in water. So we talked about aerosols. Aerosols were suspension of particles in air. So a colloid, or a colloidal mixture, is a little teeny tiny particle on the same length scale that an aerosol particle would be. That's the same length scale, but instead of being in the air, it's in water. So what this is particles ranging from, like 1 nanometer all the way up to like, I keep picking the wrong color, like 1,000 nanometers. So I guess, all right, fair enough. That's a little bit smaller than our range of sizes for particulate matter or aerosols in the air. So it's a little bit smaller, but these are 1 nanometer to 1,000 nanometers in diameter, and they are suspended in water, okay? So these are not large enough, I guess I should say liquid, to be complete. Doesn't have to be in water, but it certainly is in water in this case, okay? And these small sizes of particles don't actually settle out like you would expect if you threw a bunch of dirt into a cup of water, the dirt would sink to the bottom of the glass, right? That isn't the case here. It remains suspended. So fun fact, milk is like a very white, um, trans, not transparent, the opposite of transparent. I'm blanking on the word. I want to say translucent, but that's not right either. But it's a liquid that you can't see through, and it's white and very cloudy, okay? The reason for that is actually because milk is a colloidal mixture. That is an example of a colloidal mixture where milk has a lot of proteins and things that clump together to form little teeny tiny particles that are suspended in the liquid. So you can imagine if you leave a cup of milk on the counter for a while, it's not going to settle out and split into, two distinct regions of like water and milk. It's going to stay suspended. So that's the same case here. This is a colloidal suspension of silica, so it's little teeny tiny particles of SiO2 that just stay in solution, don't settle out no matter how long you wait, okay? So what happens then when you take this colloidal suspension of silica particles and you add cellulose to it, specifically hydroxyethyl cellulose and methyl cellulose? What you're doing is you're creating this very viscous, so that might be a new word, very viscous. So this is resistant to flow. Think like maple syrup. Maple syrup, when you pour it out of the bottle, especially when it's cold out, takes a long time for it to get out of the bottle. Where if you pour water out of a cup, it'll flow relatively easily. That's because maple syrup is very viscous. It is resistant to flow. So this creates a very viscous, what is called polymer particle, as they denote it here in this study, polymer particle hydrogel. Okay, so let's just break this down word by word. So polymer particle basically means what happens is the hydroxyethyl cellulose and the methyl cellulose stick to the colloidal silica particles, okay? So I think I talked about this in the first lecture, pretty sure I did, is that very, very, very small particles tend to be a little bit more reactive, which is why they're dangerous to breathe in. So what is happening here is the researchers are taking advantage of the fact that this little tiny colloidal nanoparticle suspension of silica is going to be relatively reactive. And what happens is the cellulose sticks to the surface of the colloids of the particles, forming like this colloid coated in a bunch of cellulose, okay? And really the main purpose of doing this is to create a material that will evenly coat something you spray it on and just stay there, not evaporate, not do anything. So the idea here is that you add into this mixture, you add this to our phos-chek or our ammonium phosphates, like so. I guess phos-chek wouldn't be that formula. Let's say we're adding it to phos-chek, which is actually what these researchers do in the study that I'm citing here. They add it to phos-chek. So the idea is that you can add phos-chek to this, spray it on a plant, it will remain suspended and coat the plant surface, and therefore, when should a wildfire break out, the phos-chek is right there. It will contain the fire, prevent it from spreading, pretty much eliminate a lot of the rigor and difficulty that is associated with containing and extinguishing a wildfire, okay? And I guess one word I haven't touched on here is hydrogel. So what a hydrogel is, so a gel is kind of like a state of matter that is in between a liquid and a solid. So state of matter in between a liquid and a solid. So a good example of this is jam. So think like fruit preserves or jam is a really good example of a gel or a gelatinous structure where it's something that kind of is able, you can manipulate it and it's malleable, you can spread it onto toast, but it isn't going to like flow like water, let's say, down a pipe or down a drain. It's going to clump up and be very goopy and thick. And that's the whole idea with what these researchers are going for here. They're trying to make something that is relatively viscous so that it can coat the surface of the plants and not just skirt right off the surface of the plant down into the underlying soil. You know, the idea is to coat the plants with this so that if a wildfire were to break out, it would be extinguished almost immediately. Okay? So hopefully this is sort of making sense what's going on here. I'll show some supplementary or some videos later on to show how this stuff is applied and real-time videos of it containing a wildfire, which is really interesting, I think. So let's just look at still images of how this stuff works to prevent wildfires. So what we have here are what are called pilot grass burning tests, where this is just, I think, no, it's not wood chips in this case. This is just dry vegetation, so nothing special. This would be something that you might find in, central California or northern California in the more inland, hot, dry regions. And what they're doing here, what these researchers doing, are taking still images, I think with a drone. We'll actually look at a video of these in a second, and we'll see that the camera is not quite so steady. It makes me think that it's like a drone that's hovering above them taking a picture. That part's not really that important, but what they're doing is they are burning a plot or just like a small chunk of this vegetation and seeing how quickly the wildfire or the fire spreads, okay? So the control in this case is when they do not apply the prophylactic fire retardant. That's also a word I should probably talk about here. That was all the way back here. Prophylactic, what does that mean? That just means to prevent disease, I believe is the original use of the word. So just think preventative, okay? So you can substitute prophylactic with preventative. I refer to them as PFRs throughout this whole lecture just because it's easier to say. So think of that P as preventative instead of prophylactic if you want. Same meaning essentially, okay? But anyway, so what these researchers did is they, tested plots of grass or vegetation, dry vegetation, after not applying the PFR. So what you can see here is that not applying the PFR, pretty much this entire plot of land or this entire frame in this image burns in 60 seconds, so quite quickly. And they test out various coverage levels. So CL is coverage level. So they test out various coverage levels to see how little of this stuff could we use and still prevent a wildfire, okay? And what they did is after applying this stuff to the plants, after, coating the plants, the vegetation with this thin layer of retardant-loaded fluid, they actually simulated rainfall on the area. So they simulated about half an inch of rain to mimic, should rainfall affect this vegetation, will it completely just wash off this retardant-loaded fluid, or would it remain intact, okay? And what you can see is that, the area of land burned in each of these studies, so that it looks like they did 3 different coverage levels here. So there's 1, 2, and 3. And what you can see is that the regions burned are significantly lower than the region burned in the control, where no fire retardant loaded fluid is applied. So, hey, that's really promising. That's really cool. So based off of just this very just I would call simple experiment here, it's already looking pretty promising that this stuff would be useful for preventing wildfire. So hey, that's cool. And you might be wondering at this point, okay, but not all vegetation is this dry brush, essentially. There's going to be multitudes of different types. So what the researchers did to address that sort of point is they did this on a lab scale, so think in a lab, like a much smaller surface area of plant matter. But what they did is they tested this on hay and wood chips to get differences in vegetation. They did different coverage levels. So what these numbers represent are coverage levels. So CL, remember, our coverage levels. And then they also did this with just Phos-Chek on its own. So the idea here is, well, could we just take Phos-Chek as it is, already a commercially available fire retardant? Could we go out into a field, throw a bunch of Phos-Chek on the plants, leave it there, let it be exposed to rain and whatever elements, and would that still work? Do we need this whole, viscoelastic fluid approach? Do we need to go through all this rigmarole of forming these polymer particle hydrogels? So as you can see here, what the data is showing is temperature versus time. So this is, in the case of this top one, in letter C, they took hay, they treated it, in this case, just with Phos-Chek. So PC is equal to, that's Phos-Chek, and they did not simulate rain, and then they simulated a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch on this plant matter, and then measured how the temperature changed with time after this plant matter was ignited. Okay, so that's one way to track the potential progress of a fire, I guess you could say, is how quickly does the temperature ramp up with time. So these y-axes here say normalized area under curve. Ignore that, just think of this as temperature, okay? They did a little bit of extra steps to make their studies more statistically significant. Don't worry too much about that. Just know that they're tracking temperature as a function of time while burning this plant matter, okay? So as you can see, if they were to just throw Phos-Chek on its own, no viscoelastic fluid, onto these plants, what you see is still a fairly significant increase in temperature over time. And what is observed is that for more rainfall, so this is our 0.5 inches of rain, the more closely this returns to just basically no Phos-Chek applied. So what this is showing is that, hey, if we were to throw Phos-Chek onto plants and just leave it and hope that it will prevent fires, if there's any rainfall, it pretty much washes all of the Phos-Chek away, isn't going to leave it in any sort of state where it would prevent a wildfire. So that's no good. But if we look here, the same plant matter, hay, if we apply the fire retardant, so in this case Phos-Chek, but now we apply it with the viscoelastic fluid and we simulate rainfall, what you can see is that the temperature almost levels off at a really, really low value, which is indicative of the fact that a wildfire would not propagate in this case because there is not a steep growth in temperature, okay? So that's what they're using temperature in this case to signify wildfire growth potential, okay? And they did this with different coverage levels. So what you can see across the board here is that at least for hay, it was pretty apparent that applying this stuff would lead to a much lower temperature after the fact, meaning that this stuff would be good for preventing wildfires, okay? And then you might be looking at the screen down here at chips. So these are wood chips. And interestingly enough, wood chips did not necessarily benefit from the application of this fire retardant loaded viscoelastic fluid, where even in the case where they apply a coverage level, in this case coverage level 1, which I don't remember what that is off the top of my head, but basically think just like a small minimal amount. The temperature increase is a little bit more sluggish. It takes longer for the temperature to ramp up, but it still ultimately reaches the same value that would be reached in the case of no fire retardant loaded viscoelastic fluid were to be applied. So, well, that's an interesting result. And even in the case of coverage level 5, where basically the thing to note is that this is increasing. So a coverage level of 5 means they're applying a lot of this stuff onto the wood chips. And even in that case, the final temperature is still being reached, sure, over a longer period of time. But this is interesting, and what it sort of is saying is that the type of vegetation that is that this stuff is applied to will heavily impact how well it actually works. Okay, so maybe for dry brush and hay, stuff that is, relatively thinner and higher surface area, that's certainly a better candidate for this type of treatment. Whereas something like wood chips, or really to me, the analog to this would be larger, denser plant matter, so like trees and things where there's less surface area for this um, fluid to stick to, it seems like it's less effective in those cases. So definitely something that's interesting, something that certainly would need to be more heavily researched should this stuff be implemented on some large scale, okay? And then let's quickly take a look at some videos of this stuff happening, just because I think it's cool. So if you want to look at the videos on your own time, you certainly can. You can just Google the wildfire prevention, just Google this title. You might not get access to the full paper. You can through the Cal State database, certainly, if you know how to do that. But even if you don't, whatever, the supplemental information is free, and that's where I'm getting these videos from, okay? Okay, so here we're on the web page for the paper. So if you go to the paper, it's up here. This is what it would look like if you were to Google it and click on the first link. You can go to supporting information, and that's where all these videos are. So how this stuff is applied. So it's not viscous. It's not so viscous that it can't be sprayed onto plants. So the idea here is that this stuff would be sprayed onto plants like so. So there's just this person spraying this stuff directly onto wood chips. My internet, I think, is a little bit slow. It's not wanting to load this video, but hopefully you get the idea. Well, this is really a letdown. What the heck? Okay, I guess that's all we're getting. But it would be sprayed on similar to like, paraquat or a weed killer. Except in this case, we're not killing the plants. The idea is to prevent wildfires. Okay, so let's look at another video. I tested it, and this one actually will play. So this is just untreated grass for how, looking at how it burns. So you can see when it's untreated, this fire is spreading relatively quickly. This is sped up 2 times. So if you're watching the lecture video on 2 times speed, which I don't blame you, this is now 4 times speed. So you can see this is spreading, really no signs of slowing down, which is what you would expect for an untreated vegetation. Okay, so unfortunately it doesn't look like these videos are playing. I guess I didn't account for the fact that when my computer's recording, it's much poorer at loading these sorts of things and streaming. So what I recommend you do in your free time is go to this paper and check out some of those videos and maybe even read through a little bit of it. It's really interesting, and if you have any questions on it, please let me know. Oh well, sorry the videos didn't work. So let's get back to our lecture here. And let's talk about the last bit of information that might be, really on your mind is, wow, look at these cool results. Wildfires can be significantly prevented just by spraying this stuff on plants, but surely this can't be good for people to be exposed to, and this can't be good for the environment and natural waterways. So what's the catch? There's got to be a catch, right? So the researchers studied the toxicity and the environmental impacts through 3 different criteria. So we'll talk about those. So what they did is they assessed this material or this fire retardant, this prophylactic treatment in terms of its toxicity, its biodegradability, which is what these last 2 pieces of data are. Gradability. That's what both of these are. Okay, so I'll quickly run through these so that you have some sort of an appreciation for what chemists and engineers think about when they're assessing something towards its toxic effect. So in this first one, so what is being done here, so you can see the y-axis is relative cell apoptosis. So apoptosis for cells is synonymous with death. So when cells are unhealthy or are under duress, they trigger a process called apoptosis and essentially kill themselves. Okay, so high cell apoptosis means high toxic effect. So what they are doing here is they're treating human dermal fibroblast cells. So basically, dermal fibroblasts are skin cells related to connective tissue. So they're basically taking human cells in a petri dish, exposing it to this material and seeing how much of the cell dies as a function of dilution here. So here, PP1, so remember PP, I had that on this slide here. I had that on this slide here, was polymer particle. So this is showing the polymer particle level at coverage level 1, so just the minimal treatment possible, which was shown to be effective, as is shown up here. We saw coverage level, here we go. Coverage level 1 was pretty good relative to the control non-treated in terms of preventing wildfires, okay? So what they did is they took that same coverage level, they exposed it to human skin cells in a petri dish, and what you can see is then what is shown here on this x-axis is this is the coverage level 1 undiluted, and then they diluted it by several factors all the way down. So this is levels of dilution. So this is getting more and more dilute as you go down. So just think of like if you take a Gatorade and you're just continually adding water to it, it's going to get more and more dilute, less colorful, etc. Except in this case, the idea is that if there is a toxic effect, you would see it slowly be diminished as you dilute this stuff, okay? And what you can see here is that there's really no statistical difference between any of these in terms of cell apoptosis. Even the control, where there is no polymer particle present, there is a relatively similar amount of even more cell apoptosis than in some of the cases where it is significantly diluted, okay? So we can say based off of these that this is relatively not toxic. And then with a really, really big asterisk there, not toxic, we'll put an asterisk. This is highly specific, and I should say 2 skin cells in a petri dish. So what we like to say in vitro in science, so in vitro just means in the lab. So this is a huge asterisk because this is not a living organ, like a living functioning organism. They literally just took skin cells and put it in a petri dish and saw how many died when they exposed it to this stuff. So it certainly is a nice proxy for how this would interact with humans if you got some on your skin, let's say, as you were applying this stuff to plants. But it is not at all indicative of how this would affect you if you were to spill some of it on you or get a bunch of it on you, just because in vitro or in a petri dish is a few steps away from actually assessing how this affects living organisms. So it is a good first step, a good check mark to check off, but perfectly indicative of being safe to use? Definitely not. There would need to be some clinical trials to assess the relative toxicity in actual living, breathing humans. Okay, but for now, just know that hey, this is cool, not toxic. Asterisk. Okay, and then they also looked at the biodegradability. So what is really important here is that this first test is what's called a biochemical oxygen demand test. Oxygen demand. And then this test here is a biochemical methane production test. So I'll try my best to summarize this with using as little jargon as possible. But basically, this biochemical oxygen demand test, often abbreviated as BOD, is essentially assessing if we were to take this viscoelastic fluid, this cellulose silica particle material, and throw it into a stream, into water, how does it affect the living organisms in it? Is essentially the question they're asking here, okay? So basically, bacteria can react or can consume, let's say, that's a better word, can consume organic material, organic matter, and convert it to CO2. This is basically food to bacteria. Okay, so if you take bacteria and you add in organic carbon, which is essentially what hydroxyethyl cellulose and methyl cellulose is, this is organic carbon. If you take this and add it to bacteria and you add O2, this can be converted to CO2 and water because bacteria metabolize these forms of organic carbon in a similar way that we would metabolize food. So the question they are asking here is the researchers are measuring dissolved oxygen in a sample of water as a function of time. And this water also has bacteria present in it, and they are measuring how much oxygen is consumed. Okay, so the reason this is important is because if you just throw a bunch of organic matter into a stream that has bacteria present, which is any stream, the bacteria will start to do this chemical process and break down the organic matter. And the reason this is bad is because it consumes dissolved oxygen in the water. Whether it be a stream or a lake or whatever. The reason this is bad is because other aquatic species, fish and even aquatic plants, are going to need some amount of dissolved oxygen present in order to function. So the question the researchers are asking is they're asking, okay, if we take this stuff, this new fire retardant loaded viscoelastic fluid, and we throw it into water, how does the dissolved oxygen change? And hopefully it doesn't change, which would mean that bacteria are not consuming it at a very fast rate and thus depleting the dissolved oxygen in the water, which would harm other aquatic life. Okay, so what you can see here is the blank, meaning no fire retardant added. They did a trial with just the cellulose bits, and then they also did a trial with the full shebang, the full colloidal silica particles mixed with the cellulose. What you can see is that there's really no difference in how the dissolved oxygen changes. Whether or not this fire retardant or this PFR is present the dissolved oxygen remains the same, which is good. That means it's not going to significantly disrupt aquatic and ecosystems by drastically changing and lowering the dissolved oxygen level in the stream or natural waterway or watershed, whatever. And then the last thing here they did as a control, where this control was they just took glucose and glutamic acid, which is an amino acid. So those of you really into fitness might know of like glutamine, glutamine as like a supplement. This is related to glutamine. It's a different amino acid. It's glutamate or glutamic acid is the difference. But it's basically an amino acid that is good for synthesizing other amino acids in living beings. So glutamic acid. But basically the point is here is that these are known to be good foods, if you will, for bacteria. And if you just throw a bunch of glucose, throw a bunch of glutamic acid in water with bacteria present, the bacteria will certainly just gobble it up right up and deplete a bunch of the oxygen. So this is what we call a positive control in science, meaning that this is something that you add that you expect will lead to a decreased dissolved oxygen level. And that's exactly what was observed here. So this is sort of the boundary, the marker of what the researchers don't want to happen if they throw their fire retardant into a natural waterway. So hey, this is a lot more drastic of a decrease in dissolved oxygen compared to if they just had their fire retardant present. So this is looking pretty promising in terms of not disrupting natural waterways should this stuff be exposed to those systems, okay? And then the last one we have here, this is biochemical methane production. So this is indicative of what is called anaerobic decomposition of this stuff. Where the question the researchers are asking here is, will this stuff degrade appreciably while it's on the surface of the plants? Because that would kind of defeat the purpose if it were to degrade over the course of, let's say, a fire season or 35 days as they tested here. Then it's not going to be a very good preventative treatment, because if it degrades at day 10 and then a rainfall happens on day 11, then it's going to be washed away and not prevent a wildfire should one break out afterwards, okay? So the question that is important here, or the thing that's important here, is that they're assessing degradation while this film is formed. And specifically, what this film is partially doing is it's blocking oxygen from getting in here, so that when I say anaerobic, that means without oxygen. So if you were to take organic carbon and allow it to decay over time, it would do so to form methane. So it still breaks apart to liberate carbon, but it does so in the form of methane, CH4, not CO2. So you might be familiar with the fact that landfills produce a lot of methane. The reason that is because landfills is basically taking a bunch of trash, dumping it into a big container, and letting it sit there. So as the trash gets buried underneath other trash, it doesn't have access to oxygen, and it still decays, it still breaks down. It's just there's no oxygen to lead to some organic carbon reacting with oxygen to form CO2. Instead, what would happen without oxygen is it just forms methane. It doesn't have any oxygen to bind to, okay? So a similar degradation pathway would be true in this case as the retardant film is on plants. There's no oxygen. There's certainly oxygen to get at the film from above, but the stuff underlying, the film isn't, a single molecule thick. It's going to be several molecules stacked onto each other. most of which are going to be blocked and not have access to oxygen. So the question is, will this stuff break down and form methane, and thus not act as an efficient preventative fire retardant? And you'll just have to take my word for it that these are very low levels of methane produced. Which means that this does not degrade very quickly should it be applied to plants. And the ultimate takeaway here is that this will remain effective throughout the entire fire season should it be applied. Okay? So these are just very preliminary tests, of course, in terms of its toxicity and its efficacy versus over time. There are, sorry, my dog's barking. Just give me one sec. But what I was saying is that there are other tests that these researchers did to show that the effects on soil also are very negligible should this stuff eventually wash off of the plants after um, uh, more than 35 days. And it doesn't really impact the soil chemistry beyond the first layer of topsoil. And even the layer of topsoil that it does impact, it does not do so in a negligible way. So all of this is to say that this stuff is looking relatively safe. So it is at least preliminarily relatively not toxic, which means that in the future, as this stuff is more rigorously tested, more rigorously assessed for its effects on the environment and people, it's very possible that we would see treatments like this being implemented more and more frequently, because as we can see here with these, pilot tests, or these preliminary tests, is that they are very, very effective at reducing wildfire spread and limiting the maximum temperature a wildfire would reach should it breaks out. Okay, so hopefully this was an interesting lecture. Hopefully this is an interesting topic, maybe something to look forward to in your careers in the fields and the realm of wildfires. And that's all I have, and that's all I have for the course. So hopefully you've enjoyed everything thus far. Like I said, always, if there's any questions, please let me know. And yeah, no other lectures to watch after this. Good luck on exam 2, and good luck on the rest of your wildfire sciences degree. Okay?